Hello and welcome to another video for Star Wars The Old Republic. Today I'm going to be talking about something that's fairly near and dear to my heart, and one of the things that I enjoy most about this game, which is operations, or as we like to call them, raiding. So in today's video I'm going to be talking about a ton of different topics, so let's get started with what we're going to be telling you about. We're going to break down the steps based on the generals you need to know, and then we're going to go into a lot more specifics about the different difficulty levels and different raids. So first off, I'm going to cover what you need to do to prepare your character to be able to go into raiding content, what are operations, how you can find people to group with, what do you need to know to start story mode raiding, veteran mode raiding, and master mode raiding, what you can do to prepare yourself for raiding and getting accepted into more groups. And then if you really want to know, I'm going to cover leading your own raid groups. We're going to talk about how to use the StarParse tool to help you with that. And then finally, there will be a section where I'm going to talk about a breakdown of each operation's difficulty and go through in a little bit more detail what might be required on an operation specific level, because each operation does give you different levels of difficulty that are going to make a difference as to the amount of preparation and the amount of skill you need before attempting that one. So without further ado, let's get started and jump into the next section. Okay, so now let's talk about the bare minimums that you need to do to prepare your character for raiding. So the first thing to know is that you have to be level 70 and a subscriber to do operations. There's no other way to do them unless you meet that very basic requirement. Now, in terms of gearing requirement, it's not as strict when you first want to start getting into story mode raiding. So generally, I've hit level 70 with this character, I could go and do story mode raiding. Now, if I just join a random group on the fleet who's not very good, I might find that it's very difficult for us to complete it and for me to do my job adequately. But because of the way that a lot of the content sinks you to level 70, every raid except for the nature of progress will sink you to level 70, and it will compensate for your gear not being adequate. So you do not need endgame gear to do that. You don't necessarily need your tactical. It definitely helps the better your gear is. But just to be able to get into it, the very base start, level 70, you can pretty much use whatever gear you want as seen on this character. But I would suggest looking into getting better gear, of course, especially as you want to start doing harder raids, even within the story mode difficulty. The other thing that's quite important is you should know the basic rotation of your class. So you should have read a guide. You should know generally, which abilities you want to be using. So for example, this is my healer class, and I've got kind of set up here that, Coastal Cloud is my priority, and I want to keep emergency med packs up on everybody as much as possible, and, Coastal Pack, Underworld Medicine, so on. So I've got all that. I've got my DPS ability set up. I've got some defensive set up, and then, set up your general user interface. So really, you should be familiar with your abilities, how to use them, and you should also know where certain other abilities are. So such as you should know where your stun break is, you should know where your interrupt is, and you should know where some of your defensives are. Those are kind of some basic things that a lot of players might not be too familiar with before they get into operations. So make sure that you know a little bit about those as well. So you can get a lot of the information by reading through class guides. So there's a few different sites that you can go to. Valk, Merlin SWTOR, and SWTORistas tend to be the most common. I also have some class guides up on my YouTube channel that you can go look through if you prefer video content. As you can see here, if we were on Merlin SWTOR, we'd go into Republic, we'd pick the class that we want to play as. There's a few different ways to get around there. And then you'd look at, the very specific spec that you've chosen to play. And you'd go through here and you'd learn a little bit about, the different passives you have, the different utilities you might want to take. If you're already at level 75, talk about the gear that you can get for endgame, and then there'll be, some information about your abilities. And then if you scroll down, you can see different advice on different rotation and different ability usage, as well as some additional information that they give you on other useful stuff. So definitely make sure you've taken the time to do a bit of research and that you've found out about your class so that you have a good idea of how to play it. That's really one of the most basic things that a lot of players tend to skip over. They want to get into operations without having taken the time to research and learn how to play their class. So there are some basic things that you need to know before going into a raid group to make sure that you're not putting too much stress on your teammates. Generally, these are focused around some of the mechanics of the boss fight in terms of generic things like knowing how to make sure that you're not taking excessive damage. So you want to make sure that you know how to move out of boss attacks to avoid unnecessary damage. So usually these are circles on the ground that you might want to avoid. They're going to do damage to anybody inside them. Or it's making sure you're standing behind the boss, because quite often he'll do a cleave to people in front of him. And the other really important thing is that if a circle is following you when you move to get out of it, make sure you don't run into other people with it. Realize that that circle is going to follow you, it's stuck on you, so move away from people so you're not hitting other people. So as you can see, like that red circle that other player had on them, they started moving towards the group, and then they said, oh crap, I don't want it to be on the group, so they moved away. Another thing that I see a lot of people make the mistake of as newer players is they pull mobs and enemies before the tank. So always make sure, if in doubt, let the tank pull first, or somebody else in general. But especially on the boss fights, never pull until the tank pulls. That's pretty important when you're not super experienced and don't know exactly what you're doing. And of course, as always, listen to any instructions that the group provides. Ask questions if you're unsure. You know, a lot of people are willing to give a little bit of advice or give some feedback or answer questions. Doesn't guarantee you'll always have that kind of positive experience, but it's something you should definitely do. So operations, what are they? So operations are group content that we commonly refer to as raiding. They are only available to subscribers. They come either as an 8-person or a 16-person with 3 difficulties associated with each number of players. So they have story mode, veteran mode, which is commonly referred to in the community as hard mode, and master mode, which is commonly referred to as nightmare, or NIM, N-I-M. So a little confusing because I used to call them HM hard mode, NIM, NIM in the past, so a lot of players still call them that, and they don't like switching over to the new system of vet and master mode. The default group configuration for an 8-player raid is going to be 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 4 DPS or damage dealers. Although experienced groups may change up that. Sometimes people even go in with as few as 4 players to do a story mode op, and sometimes they only bring 1 tank in. When you go into a 16-player operation, generally you do not need to increase the number of tanks, but you will add 1 or 2 extra healers, and then the rest will be damage dealers that you add in. Story mode is the easiest difficulty, and generally it's intended to introduce players to the group content and a couple of the boss mechanics. Well-coordinated groups, as I said, can even do this content with as little as 4 players, noting that companions aren't allowed. So this is very easy, very intro level, to give you a taste of operations and to allow you to see kind of what the story is like. Veteran mode is generally called hard mode or HM and introduces players to a lot of the boss mechanics that require a higher level of skill and coordination. Most players will find this content very challenging when they are first learning, and it can be pretty hard to find a well-organized group to play with. Master mode, commonly referred to as Nightmare or NIM, as I was saying before, is very challenging content and it requires a very well-coordinated group and the correct gear. Many new players like to try and jump into Master mode, and it just simply isn't possible to do this without paying other players to carry you through the content. The required knowledge to fully pull your own weight in this content only comes with a lot of experience and extensive playing. So you can't just read a guide and you can't just say, oh, I have the right gear, now I can do endgame master mode. No, make sure that you get some practice in veteran hard mode before you move on. Most of the operations are story-driven, multiple boss encounters, but a few operations are also a single boss encounter, such as Taboro's Courtyard, Hive of the Mountain Queen, Colossal Monolith, Eyeless for the Rakul event, and Xenoanalyst for the Gree event. So now I want to talk to you about grouping and how you can find people to raid with. So the first and most basic place I want to suggest is in-game chat. People will generally recruit on Fleet in special chat. You can see under General here I'm on Fleet. Somebody said XDPS TC, so they're recruiting for Taboro's Courtyard. And there's also special channels depending on what server you're in. So if you're on Starforge, it's Allies. If you're on Darth Malgus, it's LFG. And if you're on Shatil Shan, which is the server I'm currently on, it's endgame. So I would type /c join and then endgame. And now I have joined a channel called endgame. And people will also post an endgame chat to recruit for operations. So there's a bunch of different slang that you're going to want to be familiar with and you're going to want to look for. when you are looking to group up with people. So general idea is people usually say LF for looking for, or LFM means looking for more. And then they'll generally follow that up with the roles that they're looking for. So they'll say, 2H for 2 healers, or 1H, and then they'll say 2T, 2 tanks, and then 4D. So in my case, I'm on a healer, so I'd say, if I'm forming a group, I'd say LF, 1H, 2T, 4D. So looking for 1 healer, 2 tanks, 4 DPS. And then I would also say what the operation is and the difficulty level. So I might say EFB, which is short for Tear from Beyond, or I might link the weekly achievement for that operation. And then the difficulty level, if I say GF, that generally means through Group Finder, which is the activity finder, or that also means story mode. So, and then I could do SM for story mode, HM, DM, hard mode, vet mode, they're the same thing, just different names. And then, of course, MM or NIM for master mode and NIM. It's very rare you'll ever see people recruiting in-game chat for Nightmare, just because it's very hard to ensure that players actually meet the knowledge requirements. But sometimes you might see it, and that's what it's for. The other thing that you might see for roles is you might see DWT and DWH. So DWH means a DPS with heals. So that means that you can set yourself as a healer role under the activity window. And then DWT means you have a taunt and you can set yourself as a tank under this role. Generally, people only need to look for a DWT or DWH to satisfy the group finder requirements, although there may be times where somebody wants a DWT specifically just to be able to get that taunt when they're only playing with 1 tank in the group. Most common operation you'll see on the fleet is the single boss operation TC or Toboro's Courtyard. The other 2 ways that I highly suggest looking for raiding content is being part of a guild and being part of Discord. So the vast majority of operations are organized on Discord and never end up in the public chat channels. Not all, but most guilds will also organize stuff on their Discord and won't necessarily post that information in the guild chat. So even if you're part of a guild, make sure you know whether or not it's important to be in their Discord to be able to access as many raiding opportunities as possible. A lot of Discord servers you can join without being part of a guild. You can see that I provided a link to a Discord server. This is my personal Discord server I use for occasionally organizing raiding activity. So you're welcome to join it. Just don't be an asshat. And it's not part of any guild, doesn't require. And from there, it's also a lot easier once you're on 1 or 2 Discords to start having people invite you to other servers that also have a lot of opportunities to join raiding content. The game does offer some options to do raiding content through Activity Finder or Group Finder. So on your mini-map here, you can select your Activity Finder. And under the Group tab, you can put yourself in the queue for story operations and you can set your role that you want. And of course, you can also filter here. The thing is, because most of the groups are pre-formed, it's going to be very rare that groups will actually accept you because they're normally looking for somebody else who they've already asked to be part of their group. But you can still throw yourself in the queue while you're just running around doing other content in the game. And if they happen to accept you, there you go. Story mode raiding. So what do you need to do to get into story mode raiding? Nothing. They're super easy. Well, okay, this isn't completely true. But, if everyone in the group has no idea what it is to do in a raid, you're going to find that it's pretty challenging. Generally, though, what you need is 1 good healer in the group and 1 person who knows the basics of the fight that can explain it to people, and that's it. It is also nice to have a tank who knows what they're doing, but as long as they can take instructions, they really don't need to know the operation beforehand. For the most part, the current game allows healers to cover a lot of the mistakes and overheal significantly inside of story mode operations. Therefore, the easiest way to have success is just having a good healer to cover any mistakes. And yeah, don't be afraid to jump right in. Generally, the hardest part is finding a group. So do let players know your experience and skill level, and generally people doing a story mode or group finder are really okay with inexperienced players coming in, and those who aren't tend to be those who aren't very good themselves, so they tend to overthink and think, no, I need people who are experienced because they just don't know what they're freaking doing. So those groups are not always an enjoyable group to be in, so that's why I always suggest letting people as well. It's just kind of polite to tell people hey, this is my experience level. When you see someone asking for people to do a raid with, the best thing to do is to whisper them by clicking on their name in chat. If you just reply back in chat, it might get lost because of all the other messages. And a lot of times, I know when I'm looking for people, I tend to just look for that different colored text that is a whisper. So a lot of times I'll miss when people reply to my message saying, hey, I'm interested in coming. Of course, when it is in the endgame chat, it's a yellow text, and I do find that it's a bit easier to pick out, so a lot of times I'll reply to people directly in there. But it's better to just whisper them as well as replying in chat, so that way you've got both options going in your favor. Alright, so what does it take to get into veteran mode raiding, or what we commonly refer to as hard mode raiding? Well, when starting out, veteran mode raiding can be quite challenging, and players will be pickier about who they group up with. So most of the time, players will expect you to have the majority of your endgame gear, and will check your item rating, make sure it's near 306, and possibly that you have your set bonus and that you've been augmented. For myself, most of the time I don't care too much if somebody's augmented fully or not for doing veteran mode, as long as they actually show that they have some experience and know how to play. So thoughts will vary a lot on this. Just be prepared that some people will be pretty picky when it comes to veteran mode raiding, whereas some others will be pretty relaxed about it. And I think a lot of that will depend on the existing skill level of the group that's already pre-formed before you get invited to it. So at the minimum though, you should definitely be very close to 306 gear before you start going into veteran mode raiding. And you should have your tactical. They're very cheap and easy to get. And if you don't have your full set bonus, that's fine, as well as if you don't have all of your augments on. There's a lot of easier operations that you won't have any challenge with. Knowing your character and being able to play them well is critical. So you must have done your research and you must have practiced your class. It's not simply enough to have just read a class guide and set up your buttons. You really do need to have taken some time to practice. I'm going to go over this in the section of the video that talks about improving yourself. In terms of your knowledge and raiding experience, you should have at least basic experience doing some of the operations in story mode, so you're familiar with some of the differences between, boss mechanics in a raid environment, as well as the general flow and progression between bosses and doing trash mob and stuff like that. If the group is knowledgeable, they'll often be okay with you not knowing the specific raid and saying, yes, we'll explain stuff in fights. Other times they might ask for somebody who actually already knows all the fights because they don't want to spend a bunch of time teaching you. So again, this is where generally they will ask those questions, but it's also important to be forward and say, this is my experience and knowledge level. Do remember that there is a big difference between story mode and veteran mode in terms of the number of boss mechanics and difficulty required from the players. Just because you've done it on story mode doesn't necessarily mean you know how to do it on veteran mode. You can do a few things to prepare yourself, such as reading guides to know some of the extra boss mechanics and differences compared to story mode. And then without finding a regular group to progress through operations on veteran mode difficulty, it can be very hard to get that veteran mode raiding experience. A lot of players will want you to have some experience before they let you join, unless of course it is a progression raiding team, which the idea is that everybody's progressing through it because they don't have experience already. This is where it becomes very important to hop onto Discord or be part of a guild. So getting into master mode raiding, the first thing that I want to tell you about getting into master mode raiding is if you're asking players, what do I need to do to get into master mode raiding? The answer is you're not ready. When you've done some other raiding and you've gotten enough experience, you will have a general idea of if you're competent enough to start going into Nightmare or master mode raiding. So just want to get that out of the way. A lot of players make that mistake. So I really want to reiterate that point yet again. So master mode raiding in itself is extremely challenging because there's a few things. One is the buffer that healers have to heal through your mistakes is a lot smaller because there's more outgoing damage in general. The amount of mistakes you're allowed to make on mechanics and other stuff is much smaller because, there's less ability to heal you through those mistakes. And B, a lot of the mechanics, if they're not done correctly, will wipe the group or deal a huge amount of damage that's very challenging to recover from. So master mode should only be attempted by players who are experienced at veteran mode and who have a pretty good idea on how to raid. It's definitely mandatory that everybody looks into the gear and has good gear. You should definitely have augments as well as everything else set up. When I think about what the difference is between veteran mode raiding or hard mode and nightmare raiding, really what it comes down to is the fact that everybody's expected to do their role a little bit better. So when you deal with veteran mode, Generally, the DPS get away with just doing damage to everything. There's a lot more room for them to not worry about mechanics and not to have the whole group coordinated. But once you get into master mode, there tends to be a lot more things that the DPS need to be focused on because the damage checks are a lot tighter, the damage outgoing is much higher if you're not careful with mechanics, this and that. For example, on this boss that's shown in the background, Tear from Beyond, Operator 9, there's a mechanic only on master mode where if you stand in the circle that's not the color that you picked, you are instantly dead. So, kind of screwed. And it's definitely not something to be taken lightly, but it is very enjoyable if you're somebody who really likes the challenge and wants to do something that really pushes you past, hey, this content's pretty easy as long as you get the gear, you can bumble through it. So in this section, I wanted to go over the preparation that's required for getting into raids. So I'm going to cover a few different things here. This first part is going to be specifically on the gearing, and this is focused towards not the story mode operation gearing, but getting your final endgame gearing. So we'll go over a few of the different things about where you can get your gear, how you can get it, what you're kind of looking for. So at this point, you should have already looked at your class guide, and you should have a general idea of what gear you want to get based off of that. So now I've loaded up the supplies section on the fleet where we'll go over the different gear that you can go and get for yourself as an endgame player. So currently how the game works is use tech frags to buy your endgame gear. So you come to this part of the fleet and there will be a tactical and set bonus vendor depending on the main story class that you're playing. So in this case, I'm going to look at the knight, and here we can do show all, we can sort for just concentration, or we can show all. Concentration is the current spec that my character is in, and I can scroll to the list and you can see 3,000 tech frags and 1 million credits is the cost. So tech frags are going to be your most limiting aspect of getting endgame gear if you don't happen to farm it through other sources. If I look under the currency tab of my inventory, I can see how many tech frags I have, and there's a limit of 11,000 tech frags, so you can't buy your entire set at once. I do already have my whole set. I am wearing Descent of the Fearless with 6 pieces, and then Amplified Champions as a final piece. I've got my couple of lightsabers. They can be anything you want, as long as you get them up to 306. And then on my left side, I've got all my other items, as well as tactical, which I had to buy for tech frags. A lot of times these items will drop from certain like conquest equipment crates and stuff. They can drop in flashpoints and stuff, but definitely a lot of times you'll find that by the time you're ready to get this gear, you haven't had it all drop for you yet, so you are going to those vendors and spending your tech frags to get it. The other important vendor is the Spoils of War vendor. So this vendor will allow you to spend tech frags to buy a bunch of different things related to gearing. So you can buy all of the left-hand stuff here except for your tactical. You can also buy all of the stuff that goes in your right-hand side items. So the armorings, mods, enhancements, as well as you can buy some whole random pieces. So, you can buy an armoring and it will give you an armoring that if you look at your character sheet and you look at your item rating, mine is currently 306, it'll give me plus or minus 4 from that item rating, same as all the other gear that drops for you in most content. It's going to give you something very similar to the current item rating you're at. You can use this as a way to boost your character's item rating up higher faster. I really don't suggest it, because generally your tech frags are better spent buying your tactical and set bonus stuff first. There is a bit of an acceptance to that though. If you have one piece that's really low item rating, it's worth coming to this vendor to buy that one piece to boost up your item rating real fast. You can also see that there's a few different things in here, such as a helmet, as well as weapons, so that you can get all of the different pieces you're looking for. But in general, when you buy like an unidentified glove, it's not going to be something that's a set bonus. It's not going to be that great of a piece. So I don't really suggest buying them because your luck will vary a lot on whether or not you're going to find anything useful in there. You're usually better off just buying the specific pieces that you need to get everything set up. So how generally the gear works is you get your set bonus, you're going to install your 306 or near 306 armorings, mods, and if they take an enhancement, you get an augmentation kit, and that allows you to put in your augment. And then amplifiers are quite useful for increasing your damage, but only the amplifiers on armoring hilts and barrels, as well as amplified champion, allow you to do extra damage. Your guide should have also gone over the stat breakdown that you actually need to get for your character, So it should tell you things such as accuracy should always be 1590 as close as you can get it without going under, unless of course you're a healer class or a tank class. It should also tell you what your alacrity should be, and of course that will also depend on if you're using the guild perk bonus, gives an additional 5% alacrity, or if you're using one of the classes that has their own built-in buff, which is usually a 3% buff, and then the rest of your points, how they should be distributed. So it is important that you hit some basics when it comes to accuracy and alacrity. Generally after that, it's not super critical what you do, as almost all content is scaled down to level 70. You can get away with a lot of mistakes in your gear. If you are going to do level 75 content, the gearing requirements are a little bit more specific, as all of your stats actually apply, not just some of them. There's not much else that I want to go over when it comes to gearing. That gives you a general idea of where you can get your gear, the importance of tech frags in the current meta, as well as you should already have a general idea of how to farm yourself up to 306 items. And then there's just a little bit of gearing difference to know between level 70 and level 75 content. And a lot of people will suggest that you should actually make yourself a level 75 set specifically for all content. And then as you get more advanced, you'd make a level 70 set to go along with that level 75 set. So the general idea is that a level 75 set is going to be good enough for doing level 70 content, so it won't really hold you back too much. But there's only one operation that's level 75, so a lot of times I like to start off with making level 70 sets and then make a level 75 when I know I want to do Nature of Progress. One of the really cool advantages that you can do with level 70 sets is you can take out all of your lethal mods and replace them with warding mods, because in level 70 content, you don't need any power. The game just gives you a fixed amount of power no matter what. And then also for classes that can become a tank, they can also wear an offhand as a shield generator, and they can get a shield and absorb chance without any loss again. Whereas level 75, you do want to make sure you have as much power as possible, so you won't be doing that. So now that you've taken the time to read through your class guide, understand a little bit about your rotation, set it up, we've been over the gearing stuff, we've talked about what kind of gear you'll want. The important thing is to get some muscle memory about that rotation so that you can consistently apply it well inside of an actual raiding or fight experience, so that when you're dealing with the other mechanics of the game, you're not thinking, which button do I press next? And the best way to do that is to use the operations training dummy. These can be found on the fleet, on the bridge deck of the Gav Dragon and the Zyos Shadow, or you can find them inside of strongholds, or you can legacy unlock them to be in your ship. So right now, I chose not to go to my ship for mine. I chose to go to my Alderon Stronghold just because they do show you the different ones. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is just going to want to practice your rotation. At this point, we don't care too much about making sure that we optimize for, a parsing activity. You might have heard of that. We just want to practice. So, generally here, I know that this class, I want to sit here, pre-build my stacks of centering. Also noticing that my class buffs have worn off. You want to make sure that things like your stim are active for accuracy when you're in a raid, but when you're dummy parsing, you don't have to check that. I'm going to jump right in, and I'm just going to start practicing my rotation. Now, this class has a very static and fixed rotation, so there's not a lot that's challenging about practicing this class, other than, you have to implement this rotation quite rigidly. So if you make mistakes on this rotation, you're going to run out of energy, because the energy management is pretty tight on this class. Not every class is going to be like that. Every class will be different. Some of them you have to choose which ability you're going to get next based on priority system, seeing what's up in the queue next, so on. And so what we're focusing on right now is I'm just building the muscle memory of which buttons I'm going to be clicking next, kind of the rotation, the order of things, which again, as I'm saying, isn't always going to be a fixed rotation like this. It really depends on what class you're playing. And then the other thing that we're going to want to be doing, of course, is making sure that we're doing as much damage as possible with as little downtime between our attacks as possible. So, you really want to make sure that it's that constant attacking. So that's where a lot of players will lose a lot of damage is, they'll be pretty slow to pull off in between abilities. So they'd use an ability, they'd think, oh, what's my next ability? And then, okay, that one next. And you can see the difference now in how much slower my attacks are. and that's going to result in a significant damage loss. So that's one of our biggest areas of damage loss, is not constantly being attacking. There are some classes where energy management is a big issue, and if you screw it up, you have to know which basic attacks to use. So in this class, if for some reason I screw up my energy management and I've been doing, attacks in the wrong order, maybe I forget to do all my attacks, and right now I'm out of energy. Well, what I've got is Strike gains me energy back, so I can use that to gain energy. And Slash is my basic attack. It uses a small amount of energy, but it still builds stacks of centering. This class, I need to have 30 stacks of centering to activate Zen, which gives me energy and also recharges energy over time. So if I really screw up and I know I've bungled up and I don't have the right amount of energy, I know that Strike Slash combo is used to regain energy and also build stacks of centering, as my Strike won't. So these are things that you want to be practicing, you want to know about your class. Also, there's a few things like, if you do mess up your rotation, like say that I don't have my 30 stacks for Zen when I leap in, what I can do is I can go straight into, I'm starting doing my attack, and then I'm going to use my Zealous Strike out of order. And then what I'll do is I'll throw in an extra strike there to build a little bit of energy, and then my rotation can carry on like normal. So there's different things that you can learn or do to make sure that you know how to manage your energy when it's screwed up or when you don't get to optimize your opener. So again, this is very important. As you can see, here I'm talking to you and trying to describe this video while doing my rotation. And a lot of these things I can just kind of do brain dead in my sleep. I don't even really have to think about it because I've gone through practicing so much on this class to get fairly good at the rotation. It's a bit harder to practice healing on the dummy. You still can. You can practice it on your companion, wherever, just to get used to, which buttons you're clicking, what you're doing. As well as tanking, you can definitely practice tanking, but it is a little bit harder because tanks aren't really designed to constantly be attacking unless they're taking damage back to deal with some of their energy management issues. But it's still worth it. It's still worth practicing where those buttons are. And using the dummy is a great way to do that practice solo. Now that you've gone over your rotation and you've practiced on the dummy and you've gotten some of that muscle memory down, you just have to go out and play. There's no way around this. So, like when I was first learning how to get into operations, I noticed that there was quite a few things that I was screwing up when I was transitioning from learning on my dummy to actually playing an operation. So it's a lot harder to make sure you keep up your damage while not taking damage, moving out of the different boss mechanics, watching your positioning, stuff like that. It gets challenging to be good at your target swapping, knowing when to throw in some AoE on a boss fight, because most of the time it's a bit hard to tell because there's not this huge group of ads that makes it super obvious. So there's just a lot of different little things that you're just going to pick up and you're going to get better with over time at dealing with in real time. There's also a little bit more lag. You're concentrating on all these different things at once. So when you sit at the dummy, all you're doing and all you have to focus on is doing your rotation correctly. That may or may not include energy management. But once you get into a raid, now you have to start thinking about watching for a boss to have a certain mechanic. Maybe you need to interrupt it. Maybe you need to move where your positioning is. You have to be paying attention to, distance to stuff. Sometimes watching for ads to spawn. So there are a variety of different things that you're going to be thinking about and paying attention to. And you'll notice where you start making mistakes if you pay attention and you're observant. Once you start figuring out where those mistakes are, you can start looking at saying, how can I improve them? So if you notice that every time you have to move out of something from the boss to not take damage, you think, well, what can I do to make sure that I'm still attacking during that time? Because generally when players start out, they just run away and they don't shoot anything until they're like, oh, now I'm back in spot. But, maybe you have a spammable auto attack basic ability that doesn't take energy, so you don't have to think about it. Or maybe you can continue your rotation and you pay attention and think which abilities are instant casts so that I can move while casting them and keep doing damage versus, which ones do I have to stop and place for and how do I adjust my rotation. Same thing with, when you make mistakes in your rotation, you got to fix it, your energy's out, stuff like that. So there's a lot of value that comes from just playing, getting familiar with the different mechanics, especially as you get into the harder difficulties. The more that you play an op, the more that your brain will get used to which mechanics you need to do, and it'll be much easier to do them while thinking about these other variable factors, and it allows you to play at a much higher level because you just start storing and categorizing this information that kind of goes on autopilot. So now that you've gone through all of these steps to make yourself better, you've done some dummy parsing, this and that, I wanted to quickly go over how you can actually compare yourself against other players using the StarParse tool when you're doing your parsing on the dummy. When you go to the parsley.io website and you look up under DPS parse leaderboards, this is where people parse on the dummy, and this is kind of the gold standard for comparing against each other. So what you could do is you could find the class, you could look up the discipline specifically, so maybe you're going to be on a Vigilance Guardian, and the standard is to use a 6.5 mil dummy to compare against. You can use a smaller health modular on a dummy or not actually use the health modular at all and still compare, but look at what people are getting on the 6.5 mil. That's the best one. There's going to be the most results. Don't worry about what server you pick, and usually just go with live for the patch. You can look at previous patches, but balance can be different. It can make some issues. So I'm going to hit display, and it comes up with a ton of different results. We're going to see time to kill is how fast they killed it, and then DPS is what their overall DPS was. I usually ignore just the top few if the time to kill is significantly different. So if you're noticing that right here, 268 seconds roughly, 270 seconds, 272, 272, they're all pretty close together, these top few, so it's not so bad. You can see that even once we jump down quite a large number, 279 seconds, only 11 seconds slower than the top one. So in this case, all of these top ones are pretty similar, pretty valid. You know, maybe I would try and aim for something that's right around this 23,700 as saying, you know, that's kind of the top I should expect of myself. The 24,349, somebody just knows a lot of little tricks. They've done a whole bunch of parses. There's no point trying to compare to the very top one, but you should be aiming for the near the top, you know, or we could even say 23,000 is pretty respectable if you can get up to 23, and below that is you're starting to fall off and not be one of the top players. Now, not saying you always need to be there, but that's the benchmark you should be aiming for and comparing yourself and say, how far am I off? Way that you are going to do this when you're using your dummy is you want to go buy either from, if you have the dummy unlocked on your ship, there'll be a little vendor, or you can go to the Rishi stronghold and there'll be a vendor in the room with the dummy, and you can buy an item that does an armor reduction module. You want to make sure you put the armor reduction module on, and then you want to make sure that you use the health modifier item if you want to compare apples to apples. The reason why it's important to put the armor reduction module on is because that will allow your damage to be a little bit higher, and it'll be a better comparison. All of these parses people have done with the armor reduction module on, so if you don't put it on, you're going to get lower numbers and it's not going to look as good, period. The other thing that you can do if you want to see a breakdown comparison between them all is you can actually upload your own using the StarParse tool to this website. So here are a bunch that I've uploaded on my different characters. So I could say that I want to compare this one right here against somebody else on the leaderboard. So there are two buttons here. You can get a link or you can do the compare. So I'm going to click the compare button on mine, and then I'm going to go back to the leaderboards, and I'm going to look up concentration. So I'm going to say and pick this guy, and I'm going to click this 2 arrow icon again for the compare. And now it's going to bring up a comparison, and I can see, you know, what happened. So he had this really supercharged opener compared to me. His damage started off higher, and he also managed to maintain a consistently higher damage throughout the fight. So we can see a breakdown of damage done by each individual ability to see, you know, which ones am I hitting harder on, which force flagellation seems to be the only thing. And I guess, oh no, there's slash and zealous strike, but I also used a lot more slash because we're using a slightly different rotation. So we can do this ability by ability comparison, and that kind of gives you a really good comparison of how your rotation is done differently. The rotational timeline comparison, this helps you see if you're falling behind them. We don't always line up at the exact same time, so they're able to do their attacks a little more frequently than me, or vice versa. So that's another way to look at the rotation. This one gives you on a timeline, whereas this one is each time you activate an ability that uses a GCD. So this one gives you a bit better of a how does our rotation compare, and this one tells you how effective you are at executing it without any lag. And then you can see the actual DPS comparison, the whole fight, and the right column will show you how far behind or ahead you are. So this is a great way to be able to benchmark yourself. You can always compare against yourself to see what incremental improvement you're making. as well as you can look at this absolute performance of saying, how am I doing against the other very top players in the game? So there are a few different places that you can go to get information on the guides and making sure that you get the right information. So Merlin SWTOR, they've got a lot of good stuff for the story mode raids, and I find that it's not quite as complete for the hard mode raids. So they've got a lot of information there. You can look them up and you can search them under operations, and then you can pick the operation that you want and you can go through. Some of the newer stuff, he has a lot more info on the harder difficulties because that's what people have been playing lately. You can actually see that he's included a nice summary here of the different difficulty levels. So this is new. Actually, I didn't realize this was all here. I haven't seen this on all of his guides before. So usually I go to this very specific guide. So this is a nice new format. Glad to see it. Delphi is another website, but it's been going up and down as the creator doesn't play the game anymore. Someone else took it over. There's some issues. Been your go-to place for guides for a while. And then Volk also has guides. And of course, great resources are videos. So whether that be going to Twitch or YouTube, I definitely have a few things up on my YouTube. A lot of stuff I do have on my Twitch from when I was doing veteran mode progression rating. So if we look through twitch.tv/stream and we go under all my videos filtered by date, you can see I've got different ones about different raids that I've been doing. One of the raids that was very challenging for a lot of groups, but especially for me, was doing Master and Blaster. This operation is the Ravager's operation, and this boss is quite challenging. There's a lot of different mechanics that everybody needs to know to be able to do this. So in here, I can go back and I can look through and say, what did this player do when they beat it? So obviously, running into the wall and killing yourself is not how we beat it. So here we go, reset ourselves. And so the first phase one, is pretty simple. Little mistake there, but that's fine. You're going to take this big knockback. Nobody else is in that red. And then we're going to do a tank swap and we carry on. Phase 2 is when it becomes real interesting. So this is when the second boss comes down and now your 2 tanks are needed. That's other boss's name is Master. You can notice people have these blue circles on them. These are the mines. So, you can see how people are standing to avoid that damage by them. So now this is phase 2. So I'm going to be picking up Master. So as you can see, you could watch and say, okay, what's my kiting path? What's my kiting pattern? I'm trying to make sure I stay in range of my healer over here. You can try and look at my defensive abilities here and see when I'm using which defensive abilities. I stealth out of combat there and taunted him. That's a special mechanic we tend to use. So there's a lot of little things like that I can see about positioning, where people are standing. And I can do a lot of research once I've read the basics on the guide to put it all together and be able to see. So when I was learning to do this tanking, I spent hours and hours and hours researching this. Now, not saying that you have to for everything, but I wanted to make sure our group cleared it. I wanted to make sure that I knew how to do my role properly. So I spent a lot of hours watching other people playing, paying attention to when the boss's different attacks would come out, what defensives they were using, stuff like that. So there's a large variety of research you can do. You can go on to Twitch, you can go on to YouTube, you can go check out the class guides and stuff. And really it's about how quickly you want to be able to progress and make yourself the player that other people will bring into the group with you. If you want to just sit around and wait for other people to say, hey, we're doing this raid, you can come with no experience, you're going to find it's much harder to actually have people invite you to those groups, and you're not going to be able to join those groups as often. But now I want to give you some tips for leading your own raid group. So say that you're having trouble getting groups together because, it's just hard to find people who are willing to organize it and you've never seen anybody doing it. Maybe you might want to take matters into your own hands. Or maybe you've been playing for a while and you really enjoy raiding and you just want to start leading groups. So there's a few things that you want to think about before you get into leading raid groups. So the first thing that you want to think about is, do I have enough knowledge to be able to explain at least the basics, make sure that generally we know what we're doing through the raid group and that I'm bringing people and checking that, we're not going to totally wipe. So if you're picking up people for story mode difficulty, it's pretty forgiving, it's pretty easy. You just really need to be able to explain some of the most basic things to people, and generally it should be okay. You want to make sure that you're not bringing a whole bunch of inexperienced players. Most of the time when you do recruit, there'll be a few people who already know what they're doing and are fairly good, so it shouldn't be too hard. to have a successful group for story mode. But as soon as you get into veteran mode, it's very important that you have a decent idea, you have some decent players. Realistically, if somebody's a good healer, they can carry the majority of groups through stuff. So, if you're doing story mode and you only have one, and you have one really good healer, they can pretty much cover people's mistakes, let a lot of things go wrong as you go through the raid, and it'll be a fairly consistent, fairly good experience. Now, if you're doing veteran mode content, you can technically still get away with just one really good healer if the rest of the group knows what they're doing. But, generally we aim to bring 2 healers. So if you have 2 good healers, you can carry people who are kind of mediocre in their skill level. Having a good tank is not absolutely mandatory. It's definitely nice to have a good tank. You need someone who at least understands the tanking principles, know to point the boss away, make sure that they're able to keep threat. On veteran mode, it's really nice. So if you do have one tank who's already skilled and experienced at the operation, and then if you are bringing a second tank, they don't need to know much as long as they can follow instructions from your first main tank. So again, just as a quick recap, if you're looking to lead groups, make sure that you're considering, what are your tanking requirements? Do you need to have an experienced tank or not? Try and find that. And then always making sure that you have at least one good healer that you can fall back on, rather than 2 healers who might end up being really, really bad at healing. So now that you've got that general primer down, go ahead, start making your own raid groups in content that you think matches the difficulty you're able to lead. So once you start thinking about actually forming groups, you want to look at a few other things once you've kind of figured out the, one tank and the one healer kind of thing, is also looking at people's gearing. So if you're going to story mode, you don't need to worry too much about their gear. Generally, I just take a quick check and make sure that we don't have too many players in the group who are very low item rating, or less than level 75, and you're pretty good to go. If you're going into veteran mode, you definitely want to be checking, make sure that those people are near 306 gear. Some of the easiest veteran mode raids, that's really all you need, is near 306 gear. It's nice if they've got a tactical, set bonus, and augments are totally optional at that point. And as the difficulty increases on the different veteran mode operations, you're going to want to start looking for things like, do they have their set bonus, do they have their augments, and have they taken the time to make sure that they have things like the correct amount of accuracy. A lot of players also like to use a system of using the in-game achievements, where you can link the achievements for completing operations. It's not totally foolproof, but it definitely is something that helps filter people a little bit as well. And then the other thing that I find real valuable as a raid leader is trying to get people into Discord if possible, because I like being able to explain stuff that way. It's definitely not mandatory. And depending on the content, sometimes I do require people to come to StarParse so I can make sure that everybody else is pulling their weight. The other tool that can be really useful as a raid leader, especially when you're dealing with people that you're not 100% sure how good they are, is the StarParse tool. So if you take yourself and you go to the website ixparse.com, you'll find you can get StarParse here. So there's quite a few different features. Some of the most important things about StarParse, and I've covered this in a lot of my other video guides that I make, is the fact that it allows you to have a rating tab where everybody who's in the raid group will have their information displayed on the raid tab. So if we set up, and you tell people which raid you want them to be in, raid group, and then everybody hits the raid button on StarParse here, then there'll be an overlay in-game which will show, summaries like raid damage, this and that. You can set things up. And a lot of times I will tell people, I want you to get into StarParse if we're going to do something that's a bit more challenging, because I want to confirm that they're actually doing the correct numbers, the amount of damage that's required for us to easily make it through here, rather than, it turns out they can't actually play their class at all. Some players won't have StarParse, they don't know what it is, or they'll say, my computer is so shitty that I can't even handle running StarParse. You can try and keep an eye on some other things to see how well they're doing, but in general, it's pretty hard to know how well they're doing as a DPS or a healing class if you don't have StarParse, because, if you're just dying, you know that your healers aren't good enough, and maybe it's both of them, maybe it's just one. But if one of the healers is really good and they're just having to work harder because the other one, you won't know unless you are that healer and you can, get a feel for how they're playing differently. In terms of how your tank's doing, it's usually pretty obvious if they're doing well or not based on does the boss keep looking at the tank or not. If the boss turns around and keeps hitting people in the raid group, you know your tank doesn't really know what a taunt is and they don't know how to play properly. So again, StarParse, super useful tool when you're starting to be a raid leader, especially progression raiding or taking random people into harder content without knowing if they're good enough. This is something that allows you to objectively measure their performance and see how they're doing stacked up against the rest of the team. Okay, so I'm going to go over the different raids under the game, and I'm going to give you a general idea of what kind of skill level you need to be at for each individual one, in case you're wondering when is it appropriate for me to join it, etc. So first off, I'm just going to go over the story mode very quickly, as there's not a lot about story mode you need to know. The majority of them are very easy to do on story mode, and generally all that you need to do is have one healer who's reasonably competent at healing, as well as a second healer just to, make up for any problems. Or, if they're a really good healer, you can probably just get away with one healer and don't even need to bring the second one. But if you're not too certain how good they are, bringing two gives you that buffer. It's pretty good. You should have somebody who knows how to tank. It's not super critical that they know all the operations or know all the stuff. As long as they know the basics of tanking and can hold a boss's aggro. And then, of course, somebody who can actually explain what's going on. So gear-wise, not much of a requirement. So Eternity Vault, Kraga's Palace, Explosive Conflict, Tear from Beyond, Scum and Villainy, Dread Fortress, Dread Palace, The Ravagers, and Temple of Sacrifice. All of those are pretty easy to do. You can pretty much bring anybody in there. Gear's not a real issue. It's not a real requirement. If everybody's brand new and doesn't know how to raid, you're going to have a bit of an issue. It's going to be challenging. But for the most part, just hop right in. Now, I did leave out Gods of the Machine and the Nature of Progress. Gods of the Machine does have some very specific puzzle mechanics that need to be completed and done correctly, as well as some mechanics on the final boss that need to happen if you want to have a chance of actually clearing it and beating it. So there's a little bit of knowledge that's necessary, and a few people need to be able to know how to do some of those mechanics, especially on the final boss, to make that operation go smoothly. And then Nature of Progress, this one, because it is a level 75 content, and you're not going to be able to just waltz through with the stats being boosted by being level 70 content, players should have a decent ability to play their class and have decent stats with their gear. Now, this doesn't mean that they need to be all endgame gear and stuff like that, but generally, players should be playing at about 70%, 65 to 70% of an endgame player in terms of their damage output or their ability to play their class. So the bar is a bit higher. If they don't have the right gear, it's going to be really hard to do that. Say they're missing their accuracy or they're wearing, really low item rating gear. But in terms of the set bonus, that's not super critical, nor are amplifiers and augments. Getting into veteran mode, this is where you start seeing all the specifics raid by raid, where you really want to think about which ones are appropriate for players at different levels. So Eternity Vault is pretty much appropriate for anybody. Things hit a little bit harder, they have a little bit more health, people need to do a little bit more damage, but generally it's not much more difficult than on story mode. We get into Kraga's Palace, and you're going to see, again, Kraga's Palace is pretty much story mode with a few of the mechanics being a little more important. Trying to do some of those interrupts, target swapping, splitting your DPS, few things. But overall, it's not too bad compared to story mode, but some of the mechanics are a little bit more involved, so people definitely need to know what they're doing a little bit, especially for the puzzle with the, I forget what the droid's called, but the room where they do the puzzle and then the fire drops down. Multiple people need to do that. You can't do it by yourself. There's definitely things that make it a bit harder. Explosive Conflict, that one, especially the first two bosses, you'll tend to see people die not being careful with their range. When the leap happens, there's a debuff. And if you have the debuff and attack store and you kill yourself, so that can be a bit challenging. Then, of course, the tanks can be a little bit of a hard thing to fight as well, the two tanks. So that's something else that you want to consider. It is a bit challenging, that operation. But it's still not super hard. You don't have a real high DPS check. People just need to not be stupid in what they're doing, and you can get through it with people just having, close to 306 gear, and not much else is a big worry. Tear from Beyond operation, I really love this one, a lot of fun. There are a couple mechanics where you specifically need to know how to do a few things to get past them, but otherwise, this operation is pretty easy, and I would say the gear requirements again are very minimal. In terms of you need at least one competent tank to do this operation. I believe there are still some tank swaps, but I can't remember. I don't think you actually need tank swaps on vet mode. I think that's a master mode only thing where they're absolutely mandatory. Yeah, so again, gear requirements not super high. Just be close to 306 is about the only thing you need to do this operation. Scum and Villainy is the first one where you really need to check that players know what they're doing, have some gear. So there's a pretty high DPS check on Scum and Villainy on the final boss Dirac. And if players aren't coming in with their set bonus gear and augments, it's going to be very hard to clear it. So in general, you want to be checking to make sure that people have their stats allocated correctly, that they do have a set bonus, of tactical. And if they have augments, that's great. I wouldn't say augments are totally mandatory at this point, but it's something that you should consider looking at as well. Making sure that players are taking care of their gear and that, they generally have an idea on how to do operations and can put out good numbers. You can solo tank this one and just have somebody with a taunt help the tank out where needed. So, it's not super punishing as long as the damage output is pretty good. Dread Fortress, this one's pretty fun and it starts getting complex. You definitely want to make sure that players have pretty reasonable gear. I would say on par with Scum and Villainy for gear requirements. And the biggest thing is the mechanics are a lot harder. There's a lot more things players need to be able to do, be organized, target swapping, interrupts, and a wide range of different mechanics people need to be coordinated for. So this one is a lot harder because of the high level of coordination that's needed. The damage checks, I think the biggest problem with damage checks in this one is just having to do like ad management during boss fights and target swapping, because that can be challenging for players to keep up their damage numbers while dealing with that kind of situation of picking the right enemy and swapping efficiently. So definitely players should have experience with raiding. Definitely, story mode experience is an asset, although there's not much to learn from story mode. I would suggest that they should actually have done a little bit of veteran mode raid experience. But again, you can walk some people through it as long as you have 2 DPS and a tank who are quite competent in the group. They can deal with almost all the mechanics, allowing the rest of the group to just kind of do their thing and bumble along. Dread Palace is very challenging. It's the hardest of the easy legacy operations. And this one, I would definitely make sure that people have all their gear up. I wouldn't worry too much about amplifiers and datacrons and all the other stuff players can do to max out, absolutely. But they should be augmented at this point on top of having their set bonus gear. There's a lot of different coordination, a lot of challenges. Healing is a lot harder, especially on the final boss, because everyone's so spread out and there's cleanses to do. So you're definitely going to want to be a little more careful about healers, as well as your tanks, and just everybody in general should have a pretty decent idea of what they're doing. That brings us to the Ravagers operation. Ravagers is the hard mare, as a lot of people like to call it. It's so hard that they never made a master mode version of it, and they're like, yeah, that's good enough. Plus, we can't think of anything really to make it a worthwhile additional challenge. The biggest thing that makes Ravagers so difficult is the Master and Blaster fight. So Master and Blaster does require 2 competent tanks, although Blaster is pretty easy to tank. You really only need one good tank and the other one just has to be competent. But all the DPS need to be on, and the healers need to be pretty good too. So that fight is one of the few fights, especially in hard mode, where one bad person can wipe the whole group. So usually healers can account for lots of little mistakes, cover for people's stuff. But Master and Blaster fight under the Ravagers operation. Healers can't just cover people's mistakes, and one person can really screw up the raid group by blowing a bunch of people up and sending them flying, and everyone takes too much damage, and it's just chaos. And of course, if you don't have good tanks, it's very, very hard to tank Master, and a lot of people don't know how to do it without practice. So this is something that you have to have really good situational awareness, knowing where you're standing, where you should be standing, anticipating things, avoiding damage. So there's a lot of challenges with this operation that you shouldn't go into this one lightly. It should definitely be something that you go in with a group to do progression rating. You can practice some of the stuff on story mode, but it's pretty hard because they're just not that punishing in comparison to veteran mode. Then we have Temple of Sacrifice. Temple of Sacrifice on veteran mode, it's the walkers, and then Revan himself that are hard. Now, if you take out Revan and you just do, the Walkers being the hardest boss after that, this is definitely easier than the Ravagers, and I would say it's probably easier than Dread Fortress, but probably not Scum and Villainy, is what I would say. But definitely, as soon as you add Revan in, it becomes an extremely hard fight. Revan is very challenging. There's a ton of mechanics that everyone needs to know. All roles need to be able to do stuff. There's definitely a few things that are forgiving that are built into it, so it's not super impossible, but a lot of groups take a long time to clear this. I think my group took about 4 or 5 weeks to clear this. Then we have Gods of the Machine, so that's the Alcath themed one on veteran mode. This becomes very difficult. It's very mechanic heavy. The group needs to know what they're doing. I haven't done it myself yet. I've skipped ahead to a lot of master mode stuff. It's a pretty challenging one for sure. Like, definitely you don't just walk in there. Everybody already knows what they're doing. They know how to raid. They know how to do mechanics, and they're ready for a lot of wipes. So it's not for the faint of heart. And then Nature of Progress on veteran mode. This one is pretty challenging. Everyone's gear needs to be great. There's a lot of ad heavy fights. Having good DPS makes it go so much smoother. Like, really having that good DPS, you can easily deal with lots of ads, know which ones to pick out, how to target swap, using an interrupt or a stun. Lots of little things make this easier. So it's pretty challenging until you have really good DPS in the group who can kind of just breeze through. This is one of the few, this is, if not the only veteran mode one, where it's really about the DPS making it easier rather than the tanks and the healers making it easier. And then just the final boss himself is such a long endurance fight. Someone needs to know how to run the battery. There's a lot of things that, people just need to know quite well. And there's lots of little tricks that you have to learn to deal with different boss mechanics because they can be a bit glitchy and not always work properly. So, not for the faint of heart. Again, as expected, it's quite challenging. But there's definitely some things mechanically that are easier than doing Ravagers and Temple of Sacrifice and Gods of the Machine. Then let's talk about Master Mode rating. We'll go over those ones. Just kidding. There's no point going over Master Mode or Nightmare stuff. Once you're at that point, you'll know. So that's it for all the main operations that are story driven. There are the single boss operations as well that we can briefly touch on and talk about. So the first one is Taboros Courtyard. Super easy. Even on veteran mode, it's not too hard. The hardest thing about veteran mode would be you do need good damage output, but most importantly, people need to be dealing with the interrupts on the ads properly, and your tanks need to be getting the isotope canister on them. So if people can deal with the ads in the back properly and the interrupts, it becomes pretty easy to actually do it. And it's really just that level of coordination needed to do the interrupts on the ads and have them dealt with, and keeping the isotope buff up on the tank that make it hard, and a lot of groups struggle. But overall, it's not too bad to do it on veteran mode. Then we go into Hive of the Mountain Queen. That one is quite a big step up in difficulty for the single boss operation. There's a lot of ads that you have to deal with, so it becomes very challenging dealing with all of the ads, as well as the queen herself, and there's not a lot of downtime. People have to be really aware and good about where they break the eggs with the red and the gold circle mechanic. So players do need to know what they're doing. This is an op that you don't want to go into with players who are just like, let's just figure it out. You want them to be geared, and you want them to be experienced as well, I would say. And then we get into Heart of Ruin. This one is even harder. This is a very hard single boss. A lot of people just don't do it because it's so hard. I really enjoyed this one, but you have to have DPS who know how to do the color mechanics and their swapping. You have to have a tank who can deal with the bite wounds. You have to have really good healing. People need to be able to group up for heals because there's just so much spike damage that goes out, and then there's the ability that if you get healed, it kills you. There's just a ton of stuff. It's a freaking awesome operation. I think it's great. Anyways, that one's very difficult. And then we've got the two boss ones. I don't really remember if Eyeless has a veteran mode difficulty or if Xenoanalyst does. I've probably done them, and they're probably not that hard, I would say, especially since they're for the event. I really don't know, to be honest. So there's all your operations. Hopefully that gives you a clue of when you can do different ones when you're kind of at the appropriate level to do it, or if you're thinking about leading groups, having a bit more information on what skill level people should be at when you're bringing them into your group. So I hope everybody found that really informative and helpful. I hope that there's something you take away from this that's going to help you get into raiding, help you enjoy it. You know, whether you want to be a raid leader or whether you just want to join other people who are already doing raids. It's really fun content. I love the group dynamics, the challenge, the way that they create all these different mechanics that still need to be dealt with. And best of all, you know, don't be intimidated, don't be afraid. Everyone's got to start somewhere. See you in the next video.
At least we got lots of green puddles.